Friends matters to me. The TV show, not just the concept. I have been watching, loving, and quoting the show since early 97 and basically became an instant, full-blown obsessive fan of the show. It has been foundational in many things in my life, starting with my relationship with my best friend, who I met just a few months after I had first encountered the show. And we started watching it a lot together, and honestly, we were dreaming of living together like Monica and Rachel. And 24 years later, we do live together, and she's actually the one behind the camera. Say hi, Marine.
Hi.
There you go. She's Monica, I'm Rachel. Or I used to be Rachel, maybe now I want to be Phoebe, but that's a different conversation. Marine is not the only person I've shared the show with. I actually started watching it with my mother, and then I watched it with my oldest friend, Nicole, and then I showed it to my then boyfriend, Jürgen, and then I shared it with basically every person I have loved. In the meantime, some who used to watch the show before I met them. But up till my little brother, who started watching when he was a young child. And this enormous love we have for the show brought us together. We laughed together about the jokes. We watched episodes together. It has been a really important part of my personal life. In another way, it has been foundational because it's one of the first shows, not the first, but one of the first ones that I saw exclusively in English because it aired on a cable network in France with subtitles. And in the early days, when it was really hard to get access to episodes of shows, what we would do is that we would tape them. And because it was cable and not a lot of people had those channels, I would basically show episodes to anyone who came to visit me. And so I watched and rewatched every episode of season 2, because that's the ones I had taped, a million times in the first half of 1997, and turned from an English-speaking, like English language enthusiast to someone who could speak the language fluently. So teaching me to speak English the way I do, that was really the open sesame to my entire adult life. So yeah, it has had a tremendous impact in my personal life. But I believe that the enduring love I have for the show is not so much fueled by memories and, nice stories with people I love, but really by the unflappable quality of the show. In many ways, just like Buffy the Vampire Slayer, loving Friends made me want to understand TV. Because I wanted to understand how people could have made something I loved so much. And studying it, analyzing it, thinking about it, talking about it as an art piece, as a cultural phenomenon, as an industrial success, it really taught me so many things about great TV making. And I kind of want to share some of the highlights with you. So let's talk about it. This is Let's Make Great TV, Chapter 7, Friends, the epitome of the art of the classic American sitcom. Friends is a cultural touchstone, but as such, it is, I feel, often misunderstood. I think it's also dismissed because of its popularity. People know it's a classic, but they don't really take it seriously. I also think it has been kind of an easy target for think pieces about the way we have progressed as a society and how sitcoms from old times are now inappropriate. I'll get to the specifics at the end of this video, but the truth is, it's a marvel to me of art and industry. And it deserves respect and it deserves time and consideration. But I want to start by talking about its place in TV history because it's a very specific moment. So it ran from 94 to 2004. And the mid-90s is really like this really important moment in TV history. But Friends specifically, I believe, plays a huge role in the evolution of TV making. And the metaphor I use usually is from music. It's actually from something Leonard Bernstein said about Beethoven in classical music. So for those who don't know, Leonard Bernstein was a composer and very, very brilliant conductor. And well, he made the music for West Side Story, for example, but he also had this program in like the 50s or 60s called Young Children's Music at Carnegie Hall, which just basically teach classes about music. It exists in DVDs, on DVDs. And one of them is called What is Classical Music? And it goes on to explain the different eras of music and saying actual classical music is not all of music that sounds classical. It's a really specific time. And it's basically from early 18th century to the early 19th century. Yeah. I'm going to start again with that, whatever. I'm just doing it for now. And basically saying that, and part of what he's saying, and then he starts talking about Beethoven. And he says, this is what he says about Beethoven. And what he says about Beethoven, about classical music, is how I feel about Friends and sitcoms. So here goes. This is a direct quote. Most people think of Beethoven as the greatest composer of all time. Why should this be? Because Beethoven took all those classical rules of Mozart and Haydn and just went to town with them. His music got bigger in every way. Where Haydn made a sweet little joke to be told in the living room, Beethoven made jokes that are world-shaking, that have to be told in the middle of a raging storm. Where Haydn made amusing surprises, Beethoven makes astonishing surprises that leave you gaping instead of smiling. Where Mozart was gay, he means joyous, Beethoven is crazy with joy. It's like looking at classical music through a magnifying glass. It's all much, much bigger. The main thing Beethoven added to classical music was much more personal emotion. His emotions are bigger and easier to see. Now, I feel that's what Friends did with a classic sitcom. It made everything more exciting, more real, because it was more relatable and more emotional. It also, we'll talk about this, but it's dared to give real emotions to the characters. So, in many ways, it is like Beethoven in the idea of bringing classical rules to its climax by pushing them. But the other thing he says later on, he talks about how the next era of music is Romanticism. And you have Chopin, Schumann, Wagner, and a lot, I pronounce them French, but you know what I mean. But he talks about Romanticism starting with Beethoven, actually. He says, it all began, strangely enough, with that greatest classicist of all, Beethoven. You see, he was two things at the same time. He was the last man of the classical period and the first man of the romantic period, all at once. I guess you could say that he was a classicist who went too far. He was so full of feeling and emotion that he couldn't keep himself chained up in all those rules and regulations of the 18th century. And so he just broke his chains and started a whole new kind of music. And that was the end of classical music. And I feel very similarly to Friends. I feel because they took it further in terms of storylines, of cliffhangers, of continuity, of relationships inside the show, but also in terms of how popular it got in the world, that it basically broke the mold of the traditional sitcom. You couldn't make sitcoms the same way after that. Later on, he talks about the other romantic composers like Chopin, Schumann, Tchaikovsky, or Wagner, and then he says, Beethoven is the beginning of romantic music. Don't forget that he still comes out of the 18th century, even though he lived for about 25 years into the 19th century. But his rules, even though he breaks them, are still classical rules. He was still trying to perfect these rules. And in the best of his music, he came as close to perfection as any human being ever has since the world began. And that's how I feel about Friends and sitcom making. So it is a classic sitcom. It is a product of its time. But the way the writers and the actors and the viewers took it seriously, the emotions from the show and the stories they were telling, it sort of changed the way people made and watched television, especially like people from all over the world who had not spent that much time watching American sitcoms up until Friends happened. And I believe it really ushered in a new era of television. It forced artists to rethink old models of writing and making TV, but it also pushed viewers to expect more from their sitcoms. I believe one of the byproducts of that was that in the 2000s, multicam shows. So multicam is multi-camera. So basically a sitcom with a set and an audience, usually, not always, but in the case of Friends, a live audience, and a bunch of sitcoms have live audiences. That's a multicam, because since they do the scenes with the audience, they need several cameras to edit afterwards. They can just redo the same scene 15 times to have all the coverage they need. Single cam are comedies that are really like shot like a regular drama or a movie or anything without an audience, and therefore with one camera usually. Sometimes they still have two, but we still call them single cam. So in the 2000s, single cams got really popular. They had existed for a long time, but suddenly they were everywhere, and they were the most popular shows. And I believe it's because traditional sitcoms looked lame next to Friends, so they had to go a different route to get any attention. So all this to say, when I talk about the epitome of the arts of a classic American sitcom, I really mean it. I believe it is the Beethoven of sitcom, and should be respected as such. And I'm going to get into details because, I like to give you lists and specifics. So I'm going to call this the 5 reasons why Friends is the epitome of the art of the classic sitcom, classic American sitcom. I was going to do this whole thing again because at some point I stumbled, but you know what? Let's just move on. Let's just keep going. Reason 1, the exquisite craftsmanship. But I'm trying to say that Friends is extremely well made. Now, this craftsmanship is not an accident. Because the first thing you need to know about Friends is that in many ways it's an all-star team. So it's the time, the place, and the people. It's incredible circumstances, to be quite honest. So you have the creators, Marta Kaufman and David Crane, and their producer partner, Kevin Bright, and they'd all done something together already. They'd done Dream On, which is was on HBO, and it's one of the first original program from HBO. It's why also at the beginning of the HBO logo thing, that's actually the beginning of the opening credits to Dream On. Dream On is a great comedy. I'm not going to even spoil the premise to you. The concept is kind of fun, and you should just find it somewhere, buy the DVDs, and watch it because it's really good. And it's HBO already at the time, so there's cussing and there's nudity and all the stuff you can't find on Friends. But anyway, they had honed their skills ahead of making this show. So that's one. When they cast the show, apparently they looked at 1,000 actors, or at least they had a short list of 1,000 actors. That's already showing a lot of, that's probably, it was the cream of the crop that was cast. The director of the first few episodes is James Burrows, and James Burrows, in many ways, is a defining director of sitcoms. He directed most of the episodes of Taxi, which is a defining sitcom to me of the end of the 70s, started in 78. Among other people, Danny DeVito was in it. Also Andy Kaufman, for the people who's a Man on the Moon. Anyway, very important sitcom, not well known outside of America, should be discovered. Just rewatch the first 2 seasons. It's really fascinating. But mostly he helped create the visual aesthetic of Cheers and directed most of the episodes of Cheers. And that's that's a fundamental show of the 80s for Americans. Once again, not that popular outside of America. Definitely worth to watch. Extremely, extremely funny and well made. Ted Danson, for the people who don't see what it is. So you have James Burrows directing, but you're also on NBC, and so something happened. Basically, there was a guy called Warren Littlefield who was working in primetime and shepherd shows like The Golden Girls and Cheers, and then became the president of NBC Entertainment. And as such, really ushered in the era of must-see TV and a bunch of really important shows in the 90s that happened on NBC. And really, like, this is a time, like, the year of Friends is a year of ER. And then there's a bunch of other shows right before and right after. And that's a really important time in network television. And it's really the time of high quality. And then at the head of NBC in primetime in 94, so when Friends starts, you have John Landgraf, who in the meantime became first president and then now is chairman of FX, and has been responsible for some of the greatest shows of the past 15 years. So you have all these really important key people in a place like NBC, which actually was really shepherding creativity and putting it front and center, with a great director, with some writers who had really honed their skills, and the best cast they could find. So I just want to stress the fact that the quality doesn't come out of nowhere. This is not a little underground show. This is Broadway. What I mean by that is that it's really like the biggest network with the best that they can find, best talents they can find. So, I mean, you can't overlook that when you talk about the quality of the show. So that's the first thing. But that's not the craftsmanship. The craftsmanship, I keep talking about the craft. I keep talking about the personal, the emotional, the raw material, and then the craft comes. Well, Friends to me is an exemplary model of what craft can look like. It's really the execution, like how ideas become things, how you shape the inspiration, the feelings into something that is actually intelligible, that is actually something that is palatable for people to watch and to experience. And I think at its heart, Friends is really a personal show. I'm getting into that, but it has some great engineering. I feel like the people who made Friends are like great watchmakers, and they made the perfect Swiss watch. It is incredibly functional. It really is well made and therefore turns incredibly well. And it has sustained also through time. Swiss watch, I just said that. Part of what people say is that it was so funny because it was like 3 jokes a minute, and that's true. But that's only part of the truth. To me, the best sign to show what a great Swiss watch it is that the cut version is better than the uncut version. So now, because the show is so popular, they release Blu-ray DVDs with uncut versions of the episodes. So they used to be around 21.5 minutes. And now you have 24, 25 minutes episodes, sometimes longer. And I feel like I know the show so well that I can pick out all the jokes that were not in the original version. And every time I'm like, funny, but not as funny as the rest. Like, I get why they cut all the jokes. And that's the best way of showing what a Swiss watch it is, because they literally trimmed every fat there was. And that also shows how many jokes they must have thrown away. So there's a lot of, you can learn about the process and how it was made so well. And I advise you to watch a making of that is somewhere online and on the DVDs, which is basically, I think it's in the season 5 DVD, but it's a making of the first episode of season 6, which is definitely a spoiler. And it starts in the writer's room as they're punching up the script up to post-production, and you really see like how every step works, and you see how much they pay attention to every single joke, to every single element, how much they trust the audience and the live audience that's there. It's really like, and at the time it was really like season 6, that's like they're at the height of their fame. They're incredibly popular and successful. They make a lot of money. They could definitely not care, but they really, really care. And they're very humble, and it's really, really interesting to watch. But aside from like what we know of how they did, I want to talk about what we can learn from just watching the end product, the execution. And I want to stress that Friends is really ripe for analysis. I invite you to watch episodes and to really analyze them by basically writing down every scene and its function in the story, and see they usually always usually there's exemptions, but it's three storylines in an A, B, C storyline. Usually the A storyline is big, the B can be equally as big, but then the C storyline is something smaller, like a gimmick, like a joke that you see 2, 3, 4 mentions in the episode, but it doesn't really have a story. And it's also really well and organically constructed. But usually you have a big scene in the beginning that lasts for you have a teaser, and then you have an exposition, which sort of an act one. I won't get into act breaks, right? Act structure right now, but basically you have an exposition, and sometimes that's in one of the apartments, or it's at Central Perk, and all three ABC storylines get started through a conversation, or they talk together and then they walk to another place and they talk with another member of the group and blah, and everything gets started, and then each storyline will develop, and then there will always be a resolution, and there will always be a tag, which is like an extra joke at the end when the credits are on the screen. So this is really, really well run and well constructed, and so it's really, I find it's really important to look at structure of things that work well and can be models to just understand the mechanics of storytelling, and especially episodic structure. I've come to think that episodic structure really is that's the whole game. You have knowing how to structure an episode changes everything. So ripe for analysis. Some episodes are like House of Cards, in the best possible way. I always think of episode 4 of season 8. Just look it up if you're, but it's super spoilery. So if you haven't watched the show, maybe don't look it up right away. But it's a great thing to analyze. But I want to get to more larger points of how the show is well constructed, not just structured, but constructed from a dramatic and from a comedic standpoint. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about 3 main ways, basically 3 rules of dramatic construction that the show models, and 3 comedic rules of construction. So the 3 dramatic rules are, number 1, characters evolve. So when we talk about pushing the classic sitcom further, this is really one of them, because making characters evolve, have them change jobs, fall in love, have babies, get married. That's something that happened in sitcoms, but the getting married and having babies did happen, but a lot of the other stuff, it's really something sitcoms were resistant to, because the point of a sitcom used to be to stay always the same. So you could get the same laughter from the same places. And also because viewers actually when things stay the same. And Friends really chose to make its characters grow in ways that didn't really exist in other sitcoms. In other sitcoms, there was a lot of back and forth with something. Cheers, which has so many good qualities and is very funny, I feel never really evolved, kind of on purpose. But it's hard for me to care as much about a show that doesn't tell a story of people who change and evolve, just like in real life. So characters evolve. That's first rule. Second rule of great dramatic construction, characters stay consistent. It's not because they evolve that they are not the same people. They are the same people, and they need to be. And so their inner conflicts need to be really strong. Their personality traits need to be really rooted in something real and not just a gimmick. And they need to have aspirations that make sense for who they are and where they come from. I find the characters of Friends to be so consistent that I actually use them when I teach to talk about what a TV character can be. And I think I mentioned in the last video about DNA of a great TV character, and I kind of want to do, I really want to do a bonus video to this video that really goes into the analysis of all 6 characters. And I hope we're looking for ways to like make it easy, because it's going to be a lot of charts and stuff. So make it easy to and digestible for you guys. But yeah, I really want to do that. So yeah, the characters of Friends change, grow up, evolve, but they stay consistent. And the third rule to me of great dramatic construction is continuity. So respecting, actually honoring continuity. So that's saying that when something happens on the show, it has an impact on the show and its characters. Everything that happens has meaning. You don't just show something in an episode and then it has no influence on the rest of the story. No, you don't do that. And that actually makes the job of writers harder, because then they have to pay attention to all that has happened, and, you know, it changes things, but it also makes it way more interesting and engaging for me as a viewer. And that really is something that happened at the turn of the 90s. I talked about it, I think, in the Buffy video, because I feel like Buffy did that too. I talk a lot about how Buffy did that. But really, Friends did that for sitcoms to me. Because you could not, like, it also, like, called back to stuff that had happened in earlier seasons. It really, like, honored the history of the show and the characters, and that's really important to me in dramatic structure. Now, the three great comedic structure rules. So we're going to get into the nitty and gritty of comedy, and I love that. But let me try to make it easy and clear. So the basis of a joke is the setup and the payoff. So basically, you set something up, and then eventually something happens, something is said, and that's a payoff, that's a laugh. So a really bad joke example, but it works, is a banana peel. So a banana peel falls on the floor, that's a setup, someone slips on it, that's a payoff. Except banana peels have been so used for laughs that now it's not that funny, because we see it coming. If you see a banana peel, you assume someone's going to slip on it. So maybe there's a different joke to be made, but that joke is going to kind of fall flat. And so what you need to do is you need to hide the setup in something else. So either as an exposition that doesn't feel forced, like someone says something important for something else, and so you don't think of it as a setup, or as a standalone joke, or as an emotional confession, anything. Basically, you disguise a banana peel as something else, and so when the payoff comes, it's a surprise. And Friends does that so very well. You don't see, or you do, but you rarely see setup coming. Setups feel like normal conversation, information, they're just talking people, and then later the joke comes and you're like, oh my god, that joke is funny because someone set it up earlier in that episode. They do that all the time. There's a million examples. I'm not even sure I can come up with one right now, but actually episode 4 season 8 I was talking about earlier, there's a whole joke that comes from where the payoff is Joey says he did something, and someone says, no, it can't be you because it's a guy called Ken Adams. And basically earlier in the episode, Joey, in the middle of a completely different conversation, mentions using the fake name Ken Adams. And it's the way it's put, you don't think it's a setup for a joke later. It just feels natural, organic. He just says it as a joke inside the scene. And then later on, it's a huge payoff for the end of the episode. So that is something Friends does really well. That is something everyone should do. And I really I get so upset when I see the setup of a joke before the joke. When I get the setup and I'm like, oh, they're trying to set up some joke. That makes me mad. Part of it is because my mom used to be a stand-up comedian. And so I spent a lot of time when I was like literally a small child in cabaret. Cabaret in French is like when the comedy clubs. Called cabaret. It's different. But anyway, in comedy clubs. And so like literally sitting in the back when grown-ups would go on stage and do stand-up. And so, yeah, I hate it. It makes me crazy. And I'm going to stop talking about that because it pisses me off. Anyway, second rule of comedic construction, humor needs to be rooted in truth. Some people disagree. I don't think these people are funny. Things are funny because they're true. So my favorite stand-up comedian, his name is Mike Birbiglia, and he has a great podcast that he started this in 2020, and I was listening to an episode with Jacqueline Novak, who apparently has this amazing show that hopefully one day will be available on video, called On Your Knees. Anyways, we were talking the mechanics of joke making, and he was basically saying how for comedians, really you talk about the setup, the punchline, which is like the payoff, but the setup, the punchline, and then the tag. And the tag is basically always a metaphor of the punchline. It's just a way to milk the joke by repeating variation on the punchline and create more laughter. And the way he was saying is like the setup is the truth and the punchline is the turn. So I find that super interesting. It also goes together with the bearing of the setup. It basically says that what's important, like the way to create a real joke, is you have to start with somewhere that is based in true, in real, because that's how we laugh at the turn. Because if the setup is something like, you know how people are all green? Well, I don't know. I can't even find a joke that makes sense with that. But you know how people are all green? Well, turns out we look like peas. I don't know. Really not. See? Not funny. But my point is that if you start with something that is an observation of reality, of life, of the human condition, then the turn, no matter how hard it is to do the punchline, will create laughter because we can sort of connect to it. The other ways that we're describing it is that the setup is Earth, the joke is a rocket, the punchline is Mars, and then the tags are like visiting the wildlife on the Mars. But I love this idea because it shows that the hardest part of a joke is to go from the real to the turn. And that's very true. I feel Friends does that. I think that's why it's so incredibly relatable. I talked with my friends, Marine and Carole, who are behind the camera, about why they loved Friends. And the thing that came up first was how relatable it was, how they felt seen by the show. And I think it's because the humor talks about the reality, even if sometimes that reality is uncomfortable or is a reality we don't like to resemble. And I'll once again get to that later. But it is rooted in the reality of life, but also it's rooted at the time, the reality of that life, that specific place and time. That was the end of the 90s and the early 2000s in Manhattan, in this specific part of society. So that's a second rule of good, well-constructed comedy. The third rule is much more aesthetic. It's musicality. If you want to be a good comedy, you need to pay attention to the sound of jokes, the sound of the lines. Even actually jokes without words, even visual jokes, there's a musicality to it. There's a rhythm. It has to work like that, on that level. And I think the three really important things to keep in mind is tone, so how you say the words, how the actor says the word. It's timing, so that's verbal but also physical, like where you stop inside the sentence, and brevity. As short as possible, as efficient as possible. I think there's also something to say about the order of the words. It's really the number of times a joke is made better by switching up the order of the words. So I guess that's 4. I'm sure there's a 5th somewhere. But anyway, musicality. It's like writing a song. Telling a joke is like writing a joke is like writing a song. Telling a joke is like singing. Yeah, that totally works. Yeah, musicality. Okay, that was a big chunk, but I really needed to say all of that because we're going to talk about all other aspects of Friends, but I wanted to start with how exquisite the craftsmanship of that show is. It's human. With all this craft talk and all the way I talked about why the jokes were made blah and the dramatic blah, I feel it gets lost sometimes. Also, because of how popular it is and how people talk about like those characters are archetypes and all these reasons, materialistic reasons. People talk about the show. I feel like it gets lost that it's a very human piece of art. From the get-go, this is the creators talking about their lives. Like, this is literally the creators talking about how their lives used to go after college in the late 70s, 80s, and how they lived, how their friends became their family. This is really something very personal to them, something very real to them. So as I mentioned earlier, they hired young writers, people in their 20s, because they wanted them to talk about their lives. They also wanted people who would be ready to just work and do nothing else. Basically, I guess that's a part that I forgot to mention when I talked about the craftsmanship and the all-star team. It's not just an all-star team. They also worked more than anybody else, especially the writers. Apparently, they used to have sleeping bags in the writer's room. And I don't know, arguably that's not a way to treat your employees. I get that. I get people who don't like that idea. I also feel like there's a reason it's the best show that was made at the time and is still so damn good. And there's a real question of, should we expect people to do this kind of jobs this way? Or maybe there should be less episode every season. That's something I've been thinking about a lot. Maybe that would make all this stuff more possible to do in a better way. But anyway, they worked more than anybody else, and so they needed people basically before they got married and had kids. Even though in the run of the show, the creators and the writers, a lot of them did get married and have kids. But they really had this idea at first that we want people who live those lives, who have those issues, who have those questions. And that's where the relatable comes from. That also where the organic and believable way the characters evolve. And I'm sure some of you don't agree with this because you don't feel that Friends is a realistic portrayal of life. And it can be, of course, it's a sitcom, and therefore it's not completely realistic in many ways. I do believe in the world of sitcoms, from the prism of what a sitcom is, this one is very realistic and actually does pay attention to portray, even though it's, there's no cuss words, there's no nudity, there's no mention of certain things because it wasn't a big network, but it still reflects emotional reality to me. It really does, and I'll get into it later. And I believe that comes from the people making the show being so sincere and allowing the characters in the show to be as human as they were. There's a couple of examples that really speak to that. One of the writers, a female writer, I think it's Alexa Junge, but I'm not sure. But in the early days of the show, really early days, so she was on set and she saw Courtney Cox at the end of shooting. She started putting together the living room, putting away stuff, fluffing pillows, just not reorganizing, but just organizing, straightening up, as you say, the living room of the set. And she was looking at her basically like, what are you doing? This is a set. This is not a real house. And there are prop people who are supposed to do that. Like, why are you cleaning up? And then she realized Courtney Cox was just that kind of person. And she noticed it because the writer was that kind of person. And then she was like, oh my God, let's make Monica like that. Let's make her as control-y as I am, basically. And that's where the thing came from. And it's really, if you watch the pilot, you don't really see the control freak nature of Monica that becomes so important later on. It really, like, episode 6 is the episode where it really comes out, because Rachel decides to clean the apartment on her own and moves an ottoman, and it brings up all this conversation, and they start talking about it. But that's really is rooted in the observation of the actress being herself on set, and the writer relating to that because of who she is, and then putting it in the character. And I think, to me, that's really telling. The other thing that was known at the time was that Matthew Perry, who plays Chandler, was really the actor who was closest to his character. And so he would regularly sit with the writers, I think a few times a year, and just tell stories of his actual life. And they used it for jokes on the show and for storylines for his character. Yeah, that says a lot to me about how human that show is. I also feel in France, there's this really weird thing with laughter in a sitcom. We believe that laughter is just recorded laughter. And so they actually have to level laughter when they mix a show. So sometimes they add a lot of stamp, especially for something like Friends, especially when it got really popular, they had to tone down the laughter of the audience. But a lot of those shows, and it started with I Love Lucy, they really came up with that concept for I Love Lucy because the producer realized that Lucille Ball was better with a live audience, so they created it. I feel like I mentioned it in an earlier video. And so most, not all of them, but most sitcoms with laughter, it's actually the original version, it's actual laughter from people being in the room and laughing at what's happening. And that makes it more human to me too. Because they don't just laugh. Sometimes they whistle, sometimes they gasp. There's this really famous scene in season 2 that James Burrows actually, and I find it really interesting because James Burrows only directed 1 episode of season 2. In my head, he directed most of the episodes of Friends. Then I looked it up and he also only did 15. But they talk about him like such a mentor that, to me, I think he set it up in a way that made it really, that his mark was really on the show. But anyway, he directed only 1 episode of season 2, which is the one with the prom video, which has a scene, the last scene, the will they, won't they, the main love story of the show, Ross and Rachel, they get together for the first time for real. And basically there's this video watching, and Ross is on one side of the room, and watching this video, Rachel understands something about their past and just doesn't say anything but walks to him. Normally, slowly, she doesn't run, she walks to him, and then they kiss. And James Burrows, spoiler alert, James Burrows talked about that moment like the longest walk in American television, because you're not supposed on a sitcom to have something where nothing happens. Nobody's saying a joke. Nothing is happening. She's just walking. But then the best part of that scene that I've seen a million times is to pay attention to the audience, because it's like the audience gets quiet, but you can feel the tension. And she walks and walks, and she goes to him, and you don't know what's going to happen. And even if you do know, you kind of forget. And then she just kisses him, and they start making out, and the audience loses its mind, and they start screaming. And that's, I don't know, that's incredibly human. And I feel there are a lot of moments like that on Friends. And I'm not saying there are not moments like that in other shows. I just find it a little stronger on Friends, or there are more of them. There's something extra. That's the Beethoven again. It's like heightened emotions, more of it. Yeah. So yeah. That's the second reason why it's the epitome. It's because it's so human. Reason 3, it's the perfect combination between heart and wit. So let's talk about wit first. So wit is really, it's smarts, but it's a little bit more than that. So the show is witty because it's extremely clever in its observation of a specific moment in time that is really socially fascinating. So we'll talk about how this is only a microcosm of society, but it's a privileged white version of Manhattan, but that's kind of what Manhattan is anyway. But it's a really interesting thing because it's the 90s and therefore it's really a crossroads for social change. Mid 90s, mid 2000s. There's something about how the old values, traditional family values especially, are being rewritten. And there's something really clever just from the get-go, the premise, the idea of these people who cannot really count on their first original family for emotional support because they don't really understand what they want and what they do and how they live their lives. So they need to recreate a family with their friends. And I do believe, by the way, that this is really like the main subject matter of the show is family and what we define as family, what we expect from family. And that friendship is just, it's sort of like, it's a theme they explore, but the actual subject matter is family. Because it's about how the friend group is an ersatz family, and then eventually how all of the characters are trying to build their own and create their own families in their own specific ways. But this is a really smart move because it's talking, especially because classic traditional sitcom, not all of them, but there's really this idea, especially in the 80s, of, aside from Cheers actually, but a lot of them are family sitcom with like, the parents and the kids and the neighbors and stuff like that. And this is really breaking the mold of talking about a different story, a story that you don't see, which is in between being the kids and becoming the parents. And it's really witty in how it discusses the confusion of dating in your 20s, the confusion of love, friendship, gender roles. It really talks about being a woman and a man in that time, but some of it is very relatable to today. So yeah, it has a lot of wit, and the wit is also in how clever the lines are. The jokes are witty. It's not just funny. It's often smart. And ironically, the characters itself are not super cultured or super smart. They're actually very average in many ways, which I think is voluntary, but the jokes are smart, and therefore, wit is everywhere. But it wouldn't be as interesting if it hadn't so much heart. So what I mean by heart is that this whole story of creating your family with your friends, they take that very, very seriously. They really pay attention to that subject matter. I believe I learned how to be a good friend by watching Friends. And when I rewatch it now, when I'm much older, I realize that a lot of decisions I made, a lot of the way I think about my engagement, my commitment, my duty to my friends, and what I expect of my best friends has been informed by this show. It really has, it raised me as an adult in many, many, many ways. And it's funny because in Friends there's a TV critic I like who actually has a theory about how Friends ruined our lives by pretending, we would have great friends when we turned 25, and how we're disappointed, endlessly disappointed by our actual friends because they're not like the friends on the show. And I disagree. My friends really are like the friends on the show. We really do care about each other that way. We are each other's support system. We discuss when we have fights. We count on each other. We lean on each other. We expect the best from each other. And that's just something that show gave me that. I mean, once again, Buffy was a big influence as well. But the friendships on Buffy are not as emotionally supportive always as their own friends. And they're not perfect either. And there's so much kindness. There's so much benevolence in how the show is written, how the characters are treated, how they treat each other. And there's really, they often also discuss the differences. You see how different they are from each other and how easily they could disagree, criticize, judge each other, and they really don't. The main example is, I think, Joey, who's really sometimes real slow, but they don't really mock. I mean, they sometimes make fun of him, but not to him. They're not mean to him. They make joke about each other, but always in a kind-hearted way. And you see how they really don't want to hurt each other's feelings. And that's really something. When I was a teenager, I really had a hard time with the way teenagers used to make jokes about each other. I really got my feelings hurt a lot. I also didn't have many friends because I was weird. Shocker. But I don't know, it gave me solace to see that you could treat each other differently. So yeah, it has a lot of heart. The characters have heart, but the way the show is written and thought as heart. So yeah, perfect combination of wit and heart. That's a reason why it's so epitomic. I want to add something. So what I mean when I say this is a reason why it's the epitome is that this idea of like the wit, the clever, that's what comes from traditional sitcom. And in some ways, actually in both ways, it's like this is stuff that sitcoms had been doing since the get-go. They are cleverly observational of society, and they have heart. That's how it sustains a relationship with the viewer over a long time. It's just that the perfect combination of both that this show does. And the way he takes both of those things very seriously and more seriously than the other shows, that's what makes it the epitome. I just wanted to make that really clear. Okay, next. It's infinitely quotable. This is really important to me. A great show, to me, needs to be quotable. So this really harkens back to especially my first love. I mean, actual person love. His name was Jürgen, and he loved quoting movies and TV shows. And I used to quote stuff before, but we really turned into an art. And I think I will miss him for the rest of my life. I mean, we're still friends, but I will miss having him in my life every day for the rest of my days. Because the idea of having a quote machine living with you was really hilarious. And so other people in my life I live with quote things, not to the extent that he did, and I found that delightful. I do it a lot, and I do think that, so if a show is a cultural touchstone, it's because it sips into the reality outside of the show. It's not just because you like watching it, it's because you talk about it. But I feel you quote it. That's really the way you make it live outside. And Friends, to me, lives inside the millions of times I either think of a joke or remember a scene, but also when I quote it. And the reason it's so quotable is really because of all the stuff I said before. So the craftsmanship and the dramatic construction is almost as important as the comedic construction, because dramatic construction makes scenes pop, makes moment important, things striking, so that helps make it memorable and therefore quotable. But the stuff I said, especially the stuff about the musicality of jokes, this is why so many jokes of Friends can be quoted, can be given outside of, even talking about the show. It's because they're so musical. Like songs, as I said, you can sing them a cappella on your own. And I really have been spending, like I spend so much time quoting Friends. Sometimes I do whole episodes. I go on runs. Like I start telling a joke and people laugh and I'm like, yeah, and then he says that and he does that and I tell the whole thing. And sometimes that really like, I can't believe how much it works because it's actually super hard to write a joke that can survive retelling outside of a TV show where you don't have the actors, you don't have a situation, you have the images, and it's just still funny to people who haven't seen the show. That's really tough. I mean, it took me a couple of years of training. The first few years of loving Friends, I would just spew out Friends lines and nobody laughed. But then eventually I got it. And I remember one night I was with two friends of mine and it was no more subways in Paris, and we had to walk a long way, and there was something really awkward that just happened. So I was trying to, make everybody laugh and not think about the awkward thing. And I literally spent 30 minutes just quoting Friends and making them laugh. And that worked. And actually, I'm so good at it now that I can almost sometimes, I can sometimes really, but not all, but some jokes can survive me telling them in French, which is really hard because when you change language. But to me, that is a testament of the quality. That is also what a sitcom is supposed to be like, just like stand-up comedy. It's supposed to be something that you want to tell and retell and retell and retell. That you want to laugh at Friends, not just watching it, but afterwards. And when we were preparing this show, and I was reading all my notes and I was talking out loud to Marine and Carole. We started telling a bunch of jokes that I love from the show, and we just couldn't stop laughing, especially Marine and I, because we have a million favorite moments from the show that we watched together over the past 24 years. For years, we used to say, "Thank you, Amsterdam, good night," because of the end of the one with the football in season 3. And honestly, that's not even funny outside of the episode, but it made us hysterical. And we were talking about how, 15 years ago, Marine was rewatching season 8. And told me a joke from the episode, and I still laugh about it, not from the episode, but from the way she told it to me. Okay, I'm going to try to tell it now, and if it's really embarrassing, I'll cut it. So it's in season 8, spoiler alert, Chandler and Monica live together, and Chandler realizes there's a door in the apartment that is locked. And he doesn't know what's inside. So he goes through all this stuff to try to figure out. And by the way, that's a good example of the setup and the payoff. And so early in the episode, he talks about it with Joey. And Joey says something completely outlandish, hilarious, but outlandish, which is maybe it's Richard. So Richard is Monica's ex, for the people who haven't seen it. And also for the people who haven't seen the show, as I was saying earlier, Monica is like a control freak, like part of... that's really her main character trait. Well, one of her main character traits. She's also extremely kind and really is a caretaker for everybody else, but she's also a control freak. And she likes things to be very neat in a very special way. And therefore, the idea that she would have a door closed, it's a mystery. Especially because at the end we find out that there's a mess behind it, but that's a different story. Anyway, Joey... mentioned that maybe it's her ex behind the door, which is a completely silly, stupid notion. No, there's not going to be a man living inside the apartment behind a closed door, right? Makes no sense. That's why it's funny, because Joey would think of something outlandish like that, and that makes it funny. And by the way, the payoff is the outlandishness. The setup of that joke would be that we know Richard was the biggest, most important ex in Monica's life before Chandler, and therefore it's a huge thing for him and for her that she had this big love before him. So that's a setup inside the story of the show. That's why the payoff is funny, because we know Richard is important to Monica. So what would she hide from Chandler? Richard, right? So that's actually a setup for a later joke, which is the one Mine told me, which is basically, desperate as he is to open the door, Chandler decides to try to open it with his credit card. And of course, because he's a klutz, the credit card falls on the other side of the door. and there's a beat, and then he looks at the door and says, Richard, if you're in there, can you give me my credit card back? That kills me every time. But every time that kills me, especially because I hear Marion's voice saying it to me. But that's a typical payoff. The payoff wouldn't work if you didn't set it up. The idea that Richard could be on the other side by Joey mentioning it earlier in the episode. But the idea that Chandler would think the idea outlandish, but in the moment where he lost his credit card and is even more desperate, would just be like, yeah, I'll give it a shot. Maybe Richard is on the other side of that door. That makes me laugh. Anyway, hope it's not embarrassing. I'll just keep it. Transparency. So yeah, the quotable-ness is really because of the craft. But I really think it's not unimportant. Like, basically, I feel like saying it's quotable is just repeating all the stuff I said before. But I believe the fact that on top of all this stuff, it is especially quotable makes all the other stuff even stronger. How much we relate to the show, how much we care about the wit and the heart, how much we pay attention, we take it seriously, how much we bond as viewers with the show. That's a really big part of it. Because it's like, the show settles in our heads and lives on, for the people who love it, of course. And that's my really big thing, is when I meet someone who doesn't like Friends or hasn't watched it, I love making them laugh with jokes from Friends, and they don't know it's a joke from Friends, because I feel like I'm making a point. Anyway, infinitely quotable. Reason 5, subversive for its time, still relevant today. So this is a part where I talk about the stuff that some people have called controversial about the show, and I give you my point of view on that. So, first off, I want to say I do care very much about representation, about toxic messages in fiction. I think those are very important. I do feel those conversations, though, I really need to be on a case by case, because it's not just about certain words or certain things. There's always a context. That's what fiction is. It's context. And so the idea of just painting with one brush something because of images, words, or outside criteria, I find it to be problematic. And I think it serves the purpose of the people who don't want to question anything in fiction and just want to say, well, it's just art or it's just fiction, therefore it doesn't matter. Well, actually, it does matter what art says and what fiction shows. So I feel like I've always cared about this stuff, and I live in a time where some people care about it in a way that I find annoying. Because I think a lot of the people, to talk specifically about Friends, not all, but some of the people who wrote the think pieces telling you that Friends was homophobic and fatphobic and all these other things, which are stuff I'm going to address directly in the next few minutes. I feel very few of these people actually have watched Friends as much as I have and thought about it as much as I have. And so I feel it's a little unfair that they would just assume they know better just because they've decided that a certain word or a certain thing is problematic, and therefore the whole show is. Sometimes it is. There are shows where it is. I don't believe it's true with Friends, and I'm going to discuss why. So first off, that was the first off. Second off, at its best, comedy is about social commentary. That's really what it's, to me, what it's about. This is goes back to the court jester, the guy next to the king that makes jokes, and because he's making jokes, he can tell the truth. What other people in the court can't say to the king, the court jester can say. And therefore, comedy is a way to talk about reality, to talk about stuff that's hard to talk about, to make fun of ourselves, to understand ourselves and evolve. And I believe Friends really is that. So I believe Friends is a reflection of its time, but it also was an urge to progress, and therefore even for today, is still relevant. It was way more subversive than people give it credit for. I don't think people understand how, like, first, the idea of having 6 main characters, 3 women, 3 men, that's already groundbreaking right there. Like, as many men as women, or rather, as many women as men. The idea that people don't have to be married to have children. People don't have to be married at all. That people date and have sex and want different things, and that's normal. That women care about their work. That seeking emotional support from your friends rather than your original family is normal. That showcasing that your parents are completely out of touch with what's modern and appropriate. Having raising a child with a lesbian couple. Those are not things that were just normal. People think of Friends as like really like vanilla and regular because it got so damn popular, but when it started, it wasn't. In many ways, there's a lot of stuff in that show that wasn't on TV before. And it's really easy now to say, oh, if it was modern, Chandler would be gay, which is true, probably, because I believe David Crane is, and I think probably Chandler and Monica are really David Crane and Martin Kaufman. I think that's one of the reading of it. But I also believe that it was way, like the first episode talks about Ross having his ex-wife being a lesbian, and the second episode shows you her in a loving partnership with a woman, deciding to raise a child together and involving him. That's modern. I mean, that existed in fiction, literally in Manhattan by Woody Allen, which is kind of ironic because I feel like that movie had a lot of plot lines that later on are in Friends, but but it existed. But not on network television. So, yeah, not main characters, but still important. They had a how do you call that? How they used to call that? They couldn't get married at the time, but in the second season, there's a wedding that is not like it's not a wedding recognized by the state at the time, but it's still a real wedding with a real reception, and it's about them committing to each other, and they stay together the entire show. I don't think that's irrelevant. So anyway, I believe that show was actually subversive for its time. But it has been criticized in the meantime. So before I get more into why all the actually other reasons why I believe it was a very progressive show, and it's still a progressive show that still has a lot to teach us today in 2021, I do want to address basically the main things people criticize about Friends. Because I do take this stuff seriously. And so, number one, this is the number one thing that annoys me, because it's like this really tired joke people make about Friends and they think they're being original or clever. The Good Place actually has a joke about that being not such an original comment, but they still in the show pretend that it's a real comment, and the fact that they have big apartments, that no one with their jobs could afford an apartment like that in Manhattan. So that's the number one thing that people talk about, how the show is unrealistic. So, first thing, the show is set in 1994. So their apartment is in the Village, which is close to Washington Square in Manhattan. So up until the 80s, that's a really bad part of town. Now, it's one of the most expensive part of town, but it wasn't true even in the 90s. The other thing is, they talk about it several times on the show, is that there's a thing called rent control. So basically, there was laws that were, when people had an apartment for a long time, the people, like their landlords, could not raise rent. So from the get-go, they tell you, or maybe they don't tell you in the first episode, but very early on you find out that the apartment is actually, was under Monica's grandmother's name. So she's had this apartment in that place since, like, I don't know, the 50s or something, or the 30s actually. I think at some point they talk about the 30s, but probably the 50s. So that part of town in the 50s Rewatched The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel. Not a good. Rewatched Inside Llewyn Davis by the Coen brothers. Not a good part of town. Not expensive rents. If you have a lease from that time, you would not pay a lot of money. You would also notice that Monica's apartment is much bigger and nicer than the other ones. They also the one with less money in the beginning. And so it makes complete sense because of rent control. Chandler, on the other side, who makes more money from the get-go, from season 1, has a smaller apartment. Clearly he pays for Joey. And then when Ross moves across the street, he also is at the time employed by a museum making money. And he has a smaller apartment as well. So there's actually nothing illogical with this. I know I'm getting into a lot of details, but I feel it's really important because people have been pissing me off with this for 20 years. And I'm just mad. And we literally, me and Marine, finally, after loving the show for 20 plus years, finally got to go to New York together. And we literally ended up staying in an apartment in that part of town, like literally, I keep saying literally, but because it's really literal, a street away from where David Bowie had his loft with his wife, which is like a nice part of town, right? And that's 15-minute walking distance from Washington Square. This is really where the show is set. And that apartment, we know for a fact, the person who has it, she's been renting it since the 90s, and therefore she pays a joke of rent for that place. And it's a one bedroom, but there's a kitchen and a living room and a bedroom, and that would cost a fortune today. I also asked American people who actually were raised in New York in the 80s, 70s and 80s. I asked them, do you think this is a believable apartment for considering all of this? And they all said yes. So anyway, don't believe the stupid narrative that the apartment makes no sense. And in The Good Place, in the first season, Michael watches Friends and talks about how he noticed something nobody notices, which is the apartment too big for how much they make money. And then Eleanor, I love that show, by the way. It's like one of the best shows, but it's super annoying. And actually, it's like Ted Danson from Cheers, so like everything is connected. And Eleanor says, oh no, actually, we all noticed at the time. No, we did not. That's not true, because no, it was never true. Anyway, I really care about accuracy. Anyway, so that's the first one. My point is, the other issues with Friends, which are much more important and bigger, to me, have something similar with this, which is people are rewriting history. People are not taking the show and its contextual truth, but basically judging it with a wisdom of today, which makes no sense because truth to be told, then you can't look at anything in history if you don't do that. Of course, you should be aware of the differences. You shouldn't take it as face value, but then, I'm sorry, but then I couldn't be watching a movie where they didn't have electricity. I mean, come on. The world has changed. Thank God the world is still changing and evolving. But you can't just decide that what's true today must have been true on the show, therefore the show is bogus. That's just not real. So now I've gone into much too much detail about that one little piece of thing that technically is not that bad, even though I do believe it's important because there's a whole thing talking about these characters being very privileged. And though they definitely are in their education and their backgrounds, they do struggle with money in the beginning. And the apartment actually also reflects that. The apartment reflects that too. And they don't all struggle with money, but some of them do. And the apartment reflects that. I feel actually on How I Met Your Mother, it's a little less believable, the apartment. So, you see. But then again, the writers of How I Met Your Mother actually went into detail about how the apartment you see is the way Ted is telling his kids his apartment used to be like, and he has a really fond recollection, and to him it looked like really big because it was his place of his youth. So, like, they actually made sense of it as well. But I'm just saying, if you're going to talk about believable. Anyway. So, I also love that apartment, so everybody be damned. Most criticism are about actually things that really matter to me. Two main ones, which is homophobia and fat phobia. So homophobia, so I disagree with saying the show is homophobic. What the show has, and there was a point where I was rewatching a few years ago. I'm over it now, but for a few years there was a moment where when I was rewatching, something made me uncomfortable, which is what some American critics and analysts call gay fear. So it's usually when basically heterosexual men react really badly when they're in a situation when people think they might be gay, or they do something that might be construed as something someone would do if they were gay. And direct and be like, oh no, I didn't do that. Oh no, I didn't. No. So classical example, there's an entire episode where Joey and Ross find out that when they nap together, they nap really well. And they're really ashamed of it. And at the end, when they're basically caught by all their friends napping, they get really like flustered and pretend nothing happened. So that's a typical gay fear thing. Like, why would they care about napping in each other's arms, except if they thought that there was something that looked gay? Gay fear is bad because it entertains this toxic notion that being gay is shameful, ridiculous, laughable, all kinds of toxic. I take this seriously, but I do believe gay fear is a real thing. It was especially a real thing for heterosexual males at the time. It still exists in lots of places. I feel in France it's really, really common still. I love that in a lot of modern American fiction, it's not a thing anymore. But I do believe it was a reflection of the way masculinity was experienced in the 90s. I also feel that the show doesn't applaud the male characters for having those feelings and showcasing this shame. Actually, it kind of makes fun of them for it. I also believe, as I said, I'm pretty sure on this, that one of the main creators is gay. And I think he probably did portray that as ridiculous because he saw it a lot in men, heterosexual men. I've really thought about it a lot, and I really don't think... I think the show actually showcases a lot of masculine and feminine traits that are actually a little toxic and trap the characters, but they don't show them as something people should enforce. They show them as something that is in the world. And I believe it was in the world. I think I believe it is. And once again, saying the show is homophobic is pretending we are not as a society when we still are in many places, in many ways. And so I think the show reflects that and makes up question that, and that's good. So that's on the homophobia. On the fat phobia, well, first of all, I think there are very few instances where they actually do things that are across the line. I do feel that Monica's fat suit is a little ridiculous. But to me, it also reflects, like, honestly, most of the world is fat phobic. Like, really. Like, my mom was fat when she was alive, and she was actually an actress on television on a sitcom in France. Not the kind of, ironically, sort of supposed to have been inspired by Friends, but really, really different. Not funny, first of all. But anyway, my mom was great, but the rest. Anyway, point is, she was fat, and so not only was it a big part of the kind of roles she got, but like basically she just had fat people. That's all their character was. But also on that sitcom, the whole joke of her character was that she was fat, sort of. Fat and in love with someone. And that was ridiculous that a fat woman could just think she could get a guy, basically. So like, fat phobia is a real thing that I care about, that I've been thinking about a lot in my life. I also feel fat a lot of the time and feel terrible about my body and have felt terrible about my body my whole life. Even though now I watch pictures of me at 20 and I'm like, are you kidding? But anyway, that's something that happens. And I do feel there are too few people who actually try to tackle that issue. Shrill, the TV show Shrill, you should watch it. It's great. That's one of the shows, one of the things that tackle this, but I feel fat phobia is everywhere. So the fact that the characters of the show are fat phobic does not feel dishonest to me. Yeah, I wish they treated it differently, but once again, I don't think they plot it. I think they ridicule it because Monica felt ridiculous because she was taught that she was ridiculous when she was fat. Like, I really believe there's a couple of scenes, like there's a couple of outtakes where they're like dancing with a fat suit that are not that funny, but honestly, most of it, including, by the way, that there's a whole separate timeline that shows that actually her losing weight wasn't the reason why she had the life that she had. There's a whole separate timeline where she stayed fat and then she ends up having the same job and she ends up with Chandler just the same. Because the truth is, that was never what it was about. She's more insecure in that timeline in the beginning. But actually, no, she's not. She's more insecure with men, sort of, especially about sex. But the truth is, that character seems less neurotic than the Monica we know, who's thin. See, this is my point. The more I think about it, it's not that. That's not what fat phobia is. Fat phobia is not saying, "Ooh, fat person, laugh." Fat phobia is more complicated than that. It's about the show is saying about the fact that she is fat and what that says about her and how much happier she gets when she's not fat. And the show actually gets out of its way to prove that this idea that she became happy because she got thin was just in her head and in her society's head and her mother's head, but not the actual truth. So, yeah, not fat phobic. So one of the other thing is that it's very white, which it is. Well, once again, unfortunately, I believe, of course I wish this show was more diverse, but do you really think that group of people would have been diverse at the time? No, because society is not that mixed, especially wasn't at the time. There's actually a show people talk about a lot. There's like one of the narratives to say Friends is not funny is to say that it's actually a ripoff of a sitcom called Living Single that started a year before. It's a black show because the 5 friends are black and Queen Latifah is in it, is one of them. Well, first of all, I don't think it's a ripoff because I don't think Living Single is as well done. It's really interesting to watch and some of it is really funny and moving, but I don't believe it has the craft and the strength that Friends has, which is okay. Most shows don't. But on that show, there are not that many white people because unfortunately in American society, it's not exactly the same in France, but in American society, especially still in the 90s, communities didn't tend to mix. Even when they work together, they socialize separately. And that's actually a huge issue. And I'm glad shows now show more diverse cast because having a more diverse cast basically sort of strengthen the idea of that it's possible in your real life. So, actually, I do believe like Chris Rock was thought of as being one of the friends. Now I remember, I saw something like that. Yeah, he said it not too long ago, that he actually sort of was in talk to be the black friend. That's how he called it. I'm not sure that would have made it better. Maybe it would have. I mean, Chris Rock is amazing. But I'm just saying, yeah, it's very white. That's the 90s for you. It's not the show. There's nothing wrong with the show. It's something honest with the show. Unfortunately, it's that way. They do bring out black characters eventually, not that many. Some people then call them token. Well, then that's a real discussion. Like, what should we do? No representation or token representation? And when is it not token? How would it not have been token? Aisha Tyler, who's in the last couple of seasons, in a few episodes, she has an arc at the end of season 9, beginning of season 10. Yeah, some people call it tokenism, but that's how every other character that just has a small arc is treated. So, yeah, it's a real question. But I don't believe it's a testament that the show is passé or problematic at all. I think it's a testament that the world is problematic and we should discuss these things. But flushing down the toilet a show this good and this personal and this beautiful about friendship. Because of that, I find it's a shame, especially, and that's what I want to get to, because of all the ways in which it's progressive, in all the ways in which it is a positive impact on society. So I wrote it down because I didn't want to forget. So all the ways in which it's progressive. So one, the rethinking of what family can mean. So I really, really think that's important. It's important because for the longest time, because the nuclear family was everything, then basically if you didn't have that, if you had a mean family, if you had no family, then, well, you were just on your own. And the idea that whatever your background is, whatever your story is, and I feel the show really shows that also with Phoebe's story, you can find a group of people that will give you the emotional support you need. That's really progressive. It's actually a little socialist. The second thing was the modernity of their social values. I mean, yeah, you can really discuss, because you have my opinion, but you're entitled to your own, of course, and you may completely differ on how problematic it is in treatment of gay representation or representation of people of color. But clearly the intention is that the characters have values like that are positive. They are not homophobic, and they actually worry about being homophobic. They don't want to be racist. They don't think that's a good thing. I know that doesn't mean they don't have internalized racism and homophobia, but that's still progress, and that's still an important model to model. Independent women. So I don't think it gets enough credit for how it portrays women. I mean, yes, it shows them trapped, just like the men are trapped in their gay fear. The women are trapped in their desire to have kids, and they're trapped in the way they feel about their clothes and their hair and their looks. Yes. But they also all pursue goals, personal goals, that are professional. Actually, the entire relationship of Ross and Rachel is really a story of the rewriting of the traditional love story and the traditional way a woman's life is supposed to go. And from the get-go, from the moment she runs away from her wedding. And Monica offers a different path, where she started with career, but her biggest desire was husband and children. But at no point did he threaten her career. On the opposite, actually, at some point, I keep spoiling the show, whatever. Chandler gets sent to a different state for work, and she's going to follow him first. And she calls a headhunter to find a job in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And what happens is the headhunter says, "Oh, no, but there's this great restaurant in New York that would really want you." And so she says, "Oh, okay, I'm staying." So I think that's a pretty big statement. And at the end, what happens is he quits his job to be with his wife, because that's what he wants. So yeah, independent women, important. But the most important, I also wrote commentary on gender roles. Like, it makes fun of all the trappings of being a man and being a woman in really lots of ways, which makes you question all those stupid things. And I believe that it has this double thing. It's like it makes us feel better about having those issues in our lives, but also sort of pushes us to question the value of those issues. I'll get to the most important thing later. But I really think, when I think of the way Friends portrays gender roles, I really think of the book Women Are From Venus and Men Are From Mars, which has this really bad reputation for the wrong reasons, because people talk about it like it's a book saying men should be a certain way and women should be another way, when it's really not what it is. It's a book written by a couple therapist who basically talks about how men and women have been socialized and trained to think and act differently by society and by each other, and therefore misunderstand their intentions in intense moments and expect of the other what they would do, which is inherently different because of how differently they've been socialized. And so the saying, It's not that they're inherently different. I mean, so hormonally we kind of are, but it's also that, yeah, we have a very different experience of the world. And the path to equality is not to ignore the difference of those experience. The path of equality is to lay bare those differences so we can discuss them and understand each other, including us women understand other women. And I feel that show really does that, and it never guilts us about how stupidly feminine we can be sometimes, but still gives us space to question it and to change it and to not act exactly the way those characters are acting. So I believe that's really valuable. But the most important, the most valuable, and it's something I literally never thought of until the last time I watched the show, which was not too long ago. I rewatched the show and I realized I was seeing something that I loved very much, that was rare in my own life, but that I really wished for, and that show made me believe in. And that's the engaged, true bond of friendship between men and women. You know, When Harry Met Sally was this big, it's a beautiful movie. It's a really, really well done movie. It created an entire style of movies, which is romantic comedies, because it existed before, but it changed after that movie. But it has this idea that men and women couldn't be friends. And even though the movie was sort of proving the opposite, because it did become friends, in the end, it was true. They became friends, which made them fall in love. But in reality, men and women can be friends, should be friends, even if at some point there's something else going on, but they definitely should try, because that's also how we get equality. By caring about men and women, by caring about the opposite sex outside of sentimental or familial relationships. And that show really showed it to me. Other shows do it, but I don't believe as profoundly as this one. And I think especially the way the men care about the emotional lives of the women and listen and give advice from their point of view, but still listen, give advice, know, understand, pay attention to what's going on for them. That's actually pretty fucking revolutionary. Oops, I said a word I shouldn't say. Whatever. I don't feel anybody's watching this video. Nobody's censoring me. If someone has watched this far, you're fine. But yeah, it's pretty bloody revolutionary. It's just, yeah, I don't have enough men in my life that do that. Some of them do, but it's rare and it's hard to find. And that's believed because they haven't been socialized to do it. Maybe they haven't watched enough Friends. And actually, honestly, the couple who do that, they're big Friends fans. So, maybe there's a link there. Anyway, to me, that's what I mean when I say, and I do believe that's what a sitcom is supposed to do. That's why it's the best of its time, the epitome of the classic American sitcom. It's because it was subversive for its time, but it's still relevant today. When I teach TV writing, sometimes I have students of all ages who've never watched the show, and they just have this idea of what Friends is, and then they watch it because we analyze the pilot often, and then and most of the time they get really shocked at how funny it is and how good it is, and I'm like, really? Didn't you know this? But no matter how popular the show is, some people have never seen it. Some people, maybe it's you, by the way, watching this. Or maybe you've seen it once and you didn't really take it as seriously. Because when something is that popular, it's hard not to just see it as fluff, as candy, as fast food. But it's not. It's gourmet cuisine. It's a hearty meal, something that will sustain you. So rewatch it, analyze it, think about it, read about it. Not the think pieces, I mean, you should read them too. You should always get all the different opinions so you can decide that I'm right, but that's a different... Sorry, didn't mean to do that. Well, that's just that's how I feel. But seriously though, no matter whether you like it or not, watching Friends will teach you so much about comedy, about narrative structure, about TV, about character building, about character evolution. It's just so much there. So much there. And I would advise you, if you look up on the internet, you'll find a script for the show. So apparently the creators did a 7-page treatment and then they wrote a script in 3 days for the first episode. And in that script, the only thing they wrote about the show outside of the script was there's a first page with 4 lines on each of the 6 characters. Three lines maybe. And that's just the show in a nutshell. And I think it's a great lesson for us TV writers to look at that and be, okay, it can be this simple and it should be this direct and simple. This is what characterization should be about. And the characterization is then followed by they are in their 20s all trying to figure it out. And that's it. And you have the show. And this is a lesson in writing. And of course, the lesson in creating is that they just talked about their own lives. Yeah. But yeah, all as I said, I feel is important and interesting, but don't skip the step of watching it yourself and finding what you want and what you need from that show. So yeah, watch Friends, because it's the epitome of the art of the classic American sitcom. I love this title. Okay. So I want to thank the creators of Friends. I want to thank Matthew Perry, Jennifer Aniston, Courtney Cox, David Schwimmer, Matt LeBlanc, and Lisa Kudrow for giving me so much in my life. I want to thank all the people who've watched Friends with me and laughed at my jokes from Friends with me, even the ones who didn't like Friends. I want to thank my mom for caring so much about sitcoms and wanting to watch it. Even though technically she watched something in the first season and thought it was not funny and then told me it was a lame show and then we took us a year to get into it. But in the end, she saw the light and decided they did a marathon of season 2 one night in March of 97, and she decided to invite friends and people so we could stay up all night to watch it, and not all moms would do that. And that, I believe, not sleeping that night but just watching the entire second season all night did something to my brain, and I'm so thankful for that. I want to thank, but I keep saying I want to watch Friends now. But I also want to thank Marine, my best friend, for watching so much Friends with me, for loving the show so much. It was our first love together a year before we knew about Buffy. And we just spent so much time. We talked so much about it. We collected books. Some of them are behind me. Thank you for loving the show as much as I did.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Carol, for coming into our family and already liking Friends so we didn't have to convince you. That's really helpful. But mostly, oh God, thank you to the show for making me laugh so much. So I guess this is the thing I forgot to mention. My first big adult depression was in 2000. Well, actually, I had one in 2002, but I couldn't really handle it. But 2005, I had this long stretch where I literally couldn't fall asleep anymore because I got anxiety attack the moment the light was turned off, and I just watched Friends. And in minutes, I would fall asleep because watching Friends made me feel safe and made me feel comfortable and loved somehow, because I don't know how to explain it differently. It felt like the reality of the world that was making me anxious and scared and depressed, I was out of it. I was suddenly in a different reality, the reality of Friends where people loved each other. And so I think it literally saved my sanity So I didn't even think of mentioning it before that, but yeah, thank you to friends. I don't know if there's going to be a song for this episode, because the truth is the algorithm of the videos get all screwed up when I use songs of artists I love, which I hate that I can't do that. But whatever music is there, you know, it's still nice with music, right? Anyway, I want to thank whoever was the person who made the music that is playing. And I want to thank you guys for watching. Some of you comment, not enough of you. I want to know what you're thinking. So if you're watching this, please comment, say something. This was super long, but turned out I had a lot to say. This is an important show for me. So next one might be shorter. We'll see. Bye. Là, j'ai l'impression que c'est un blooper de beginning. Dans un cartoon, tu te serais explosé par terre.
Ah non, mais j'ai fait bien, j'étais dans mon sang. Ah non, c'était super. C'était super pour recoiffer.
En plus, c'est bien parce que maintenant, je t'ai donné une mission de checker mes mèches. Du coup, tu checkes mes mèches pour de vrai, tout le temps. That's cool. Non? Non?
T'avais fait un.
Checking the hair. Okay. I think.
By the way.
Yeah, I'm just gonna do it now. Okay, so